So I'm Marshall Burke. I am first going to speak for 15 minutes, or as much time as I give myself, since I'm also moderating. But we have a great session today focused on economic development. So thank you. And thanks again to the organizers. I was nominally involved, but folks here at SIGA did most of the hard work. So thanks again for organizing this super great event. So I am a junior faculty at Stanford, and I'm in the Earth System Science Department, which might imply that I actually know something about remote sensing or computer vision. That's not the case. My PhD is in economics here, actually, but I happen to work with some of the world experts in remote sensing and in computer vision. So I should start by acknowledging my other Stanford collaborators on this work. There we go. Okay. So folks who were around for the earlier part of the day, and particularly Gordon's talk before, he gave a nice introduction of how social scientists and economists in particular have been thinking about space for a long time. And outside of economics, of course, people have been doing this for even longer. There's a Department of Geography here, for instance, and those folks think very explicitly about space and have been doing it for a long time. So economists are maybe a little bit late to the party, but as Gordon pointed out nicely, that folks have been thinking about this for a while. But I would argue that we're sort of on the cusp of a geospatial revolution, let's call it, in economics and in social sciences more broadly. And that's sort of enabled for three reasons. One is new sources of data that you guys have heard about. So satellites being one I'll talk about here in a moment, and one that is front and center in a lot of what you've heard so far. Data from other sensors, data from cell phones. Josh Blumenstock here has done a lot of great work on that. And other new sources of administrative data that have either been sitting in a basement somewhere or have newly come available that are geo-referenced that we can use to ask spatial questions that we couldn't ask before. So new data. Second is new tools. Again, this will be a large focus of tomorrow. A lot of the new tools that have been developed both at universities and in the private sector that are really changing the way we can work with spatial data. Both sort of our access to these tools has improved, and the scale at which they allow us to do analyses has sort of changed fundamentally in the last few years. And finally, sort of new methods. And this is related to the tools, but especially in economics. So machine learning is sort of hot in economics now. It's rapidly permeating a lot of what we study. This is true in economic development and also in other fields in economics. But it's not just machine learning. So trade is hot again in econ, right? And trade economists have been thinking explicitly about space for a long time. That's now really cool again in economics. And so that's part of the revolution here. Okay. And maybe a leading indicator is you read economics papers and you actually see maps published in economics papers. This is like sort of a new thing. Well, it's new to have figures at all, and right, we're used to these really boring tables, but now we actually see maps. So I don't know if Saul is here. He ragged on me earlier. So if I don't think he's here, unfortunately. So if you had the fortune, or in my case, the misfortune of opening the New York Times on June 29th, 2017, oh, there's Saul, yeah, good. 2017, you saw this beautiful interactive map. And like I like to read the New York Times, so I opened the New York Times sort of throughout the day, and this map was always front and center throughout the day. So like most of you, or maybe you guys aren't like this, when a friend succeeds, it's about 10% pride and 90% jealousy. But there's a paper Saul and colleagues had in Science, and it's got amazing coverage in the New York Times, right? So this is the power of maps as sort of filtered through social science into the more popular press, right? So maps are in right now, and these things can have huge sort of social impact. So go Saul, not jealous. Okay, so I think there's sort of two flavors of the main applications that we've seen so far. And in the talks that follow, I think we'll see both of these and maybe some convex combination of the two. The first is, I'll just say, taking space more seriously in what we think of as traditional analysis of economic development. And again, a few of the talks you'll see in a moment will focus, I would say, explicitly on that. The second is in measuring and trying to better understand some of these outcomes that so far have been really poorly measured, but that we might be able to get a new handle on given all the new data and sort of new techniques that are available. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. Work colleagues and I down at Stanford have done thinking about how to use satellite information to shed light on economic development in poor parts of the world. So again, we've seen a lot of talks on this. This will be one approach. I think many of these approaches are complementary, and I'm really, it's a rapidly evolving field, so excited to see where it can go, I guess. Okay, so every few years, every 15 years, we come together, we sign a bunch of development goals. These goals have targets. And we're supposed to measure these targets, and we're supposed to meet certain targets. In this case, the latest round of the Sustainable Development Goals, we're supposed to meet certain targets by 2030, right? To be able to meet those targets, we obviously need to be able to measure them. And for most of these targets, we're doing a very, very bad job of measuring them currently, right? So let's take number one. First Sustainable Development Goal, eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. Of course, this is something we can get behind. But we're not collecting the data to even understand our progress towards that goal, much less evaluate the programs that should get us towards that goal, right? So as best I can tell, and maybe the World Bank folks, JP or anyone else in the audience can correct me if this is wrong, but as best I can tell from scraping the World Bank website, so this is Africa, obviously. The shading here is the number of publicly available geo-referenced consumption expenditure surveys that exist over the last decade, roughly, right? So the median country conducted one poverty survey, and at least 25% of countries have no publicly available geo-referenced data on consumption expenditure, right? And again, this is the outcome we want to measure if we want to understand our progress towards eliminating extreme poverty, right? So signing up for these goals is basically like signing up for a weight loss program, but not having a scale, right? This would be the analogy. And maybe there are some obvious political reasons to do that, but from a sort of research and economic development perspective, it's not what we want. Okay, so we're not collecting survey information, but we're clearly collecting a lot of other types of information, and one of which is satellite imagery. So when I was putting these slides together, you can easily go on Google Maps, right, and pull off a picture of, and so we are right, I think, here. Yeah, this is us, right? So anywhere in the world, right, there's just amazing capability now where you can go on and pull off this image. So we're collecting tons and tons of data on these regions, right? So it's not just Berkeley, California. It's also, you know, parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa, places where we don't have traditional survey data, but we have many other types of data. Okay, so the challenge, of course, is how do we learn from this, let's say, non-traditional sources of data, right? So there are a couple challenges here. Number one is, what do we look for in the imagery, right? What is important? So let's say our goal is to predict variation in economic well-being, just over space for now. Let's forget about time. Just over space. What's important in this image for making those sorts of predictions, right? And we could all come up with lists, and people have mentioned lists. We could think about observed infrastructure. We could think about building size, building types, various things you observe in the imagery. So number one, we have to solve that problem. What do we look for? Number two, how do we actually validate it, right? And here it's a fundamental chicken and egg problem, right? We need to be able to validate any predictions we have, but we have very little. The whole problem is that we don't have much ground truth data. And as Joe pointed out before, I don't know if Joe is still here, truth is difficult here. We have a lot of ground data, but we know some of these ground-based measurements to be noisy, right? So we have imperfect and often measured ground data. And we have to figure out what to do with it. Okay, so here's where the CS stuff comes in. And folks have mentioned, I think, Imagenet in passing before and convolutional neural nets. Let me get back to those in a second. So there have been huge advances in computer vision in the last 3 to 4 years. Fundamental changes in the ability of computers to figure out what's in an image. And a lot of that progress occurred due to this. And I don't know if you can see this very well, this Imagenet competition started by a professor who's now at Stanford. And what they did is basically use Mechanical Turk. They pulled a bunch of images, millions and millions of images from Google Images, basically. And then they had people on Mechanical Turk go through and label these images. So here you can see an example. This is English foxhound. So people, like, and the typologies are incredibly detailed here, right? So it started out much simpler. It was like dog, cat, squirrel, sort of the canonical examples, hamster, weasel. And now it's gotten, you know, we need to tell the difference between an English foxhound and some other kind of foxhound. I don't know if there are other kinds, but Imagenet can do that now. So basically what they did is create this huge database, this huge archive of labeled images, right? Where labels here means we have an image and the label tells me what it is: dog, cat, English foxhound, whatever. Okay, so we created tons and tons of training data, and this was all manually labeled, right? And on top of that, we developed new computational techniques and new architectures to really take advantage of these huge new data sets, okay? So here's a setting in which we have new models, and we're going to try to use those new models, but we have tons and tons of training data, right? And that's where these models have really shown. Okay, so the problem, of course, in our setting is we just don't have that much training data. So we have to figure, the sort of insight here was in figuring out how to leverage the small amount of training data that we have. So I'm going to show you how we did it. It's not necessarily the best way, and there are hopefully many ways in which this can be improved. We took an approach that we're going to call transfer learning. And let me torture you with a quick analogy here. And be honest, who remembers and loves the heartwarming tale, Cool Runnings? Right, it's the tale of the Jamaican bobsled team, right? And so what was their problem? Their problem is they wanted to compete in the Olympics. If you haven't seen the movies, it's the Jamaican bobsled team. They live in Jamaica. It doesn't snow much in Jamaica. They want to participate in the Olympics, but they can't train where they want to be able to train, right? There's no snow. There's no data to torture the analogy, right? So where do they train? They have to train somewhere else. They train on a hill in a crappy wagon, right? And then they want to apply that learning to the setting in which it matters, which is actually the bobsled team in real snow, right? Okay, end of tortured analogy. Okay, so the analogy, of course, is we want to be able to predict poverty. We have tons and tons of satellite information, but we just don't have enough labeled images, right? We have literally hundreds or thousands of labeled images instead of tens of millions of images. And so we can't take these off-the-shelf models that computer vision folks are used to using and apply them in this way. We need some intermediate step. So what we're going to do is we're going to use night lights as an intermediate step. So again, our goal here is to extract information from daytime imagery. And we're going to do that in two steps. Step one, we are going to use nighttime lights, which are a proxy, an imperfect proxy, as folks have already pointed out, an imperfect proxy for economic development, but a numerous proxy, right? We have labels. We have labeled nighttime images for everywhere in the world. So we're going to use those as labels, and we're going to use those labels to help us extract features from the daytime imagery. Okay, so here's nighttime lights, as you've seen. So sitting between that is a deep learning model, a convolutional neural net, and it's, these models have 50 million parameters, right? So they're incredibly data hungry, and night lights sort of gives us just enough data to be able to run these models. So what we do is the model learns features that are predictive of nighttime lights. So again, nighttime lights is a correlated but imperfect proxy for economic development. Step two, I'll skip the CNN architecture. Step two, we're going to throw away the nighttime lights. We're going to save the features we extracted, right? And we're going to use those features to predict poverty. So think of these features as a lower dimensional summary of incredibly high dimensional information that's in the satellite images. Okay, so it works pretty well. So the two outcomes we tried to predict were asset wealth as measured in the DHS, the Demographic and Health Survey. So this is available in most sub-Saharan African countries, or 30 sub-Saharan African countries over multiple years. We also predict consumption expenditure in the LSMS. The assets looked a little bit better, so I'll show you the assets. We've done this in 5 countries now, and we're actively trying to scale it up to the other countries, and more on that soon. That's not quite ready for public consumption. But it turns out daytime images do pretty well. So these are cross-validated, so fully out-of-sample predictions. So the relationship between observed asset score at the village level, so we're making village level predictions where we only have the geocodes of the villages, we don't have household level geocodes in the publicly available data. So the best we can do in the data is make predictions at the village level, and the correlation between observed asset score, as you can see on the X here, and predicted asset score from our model is pretty high. So we explain, so here in Nigeria, we explain about 70% of the variance, right, using the daytime images. Okay. So then if you trust those, you can throw those on a map, and I apologize to the 10% of males in here who are red-green colorblind. You cannot see this map. I'll fix it. This is a map. If you take these estimates seriously, and actually here we're using the consumption expenditure estimates, which I don't show you. We explain about 50% of the consumption expenditure variation. Right, we can aggregate that up to the admin 2 level or admin 3 level or sort of whatever you want. We can make really granular predictions and produce maps like these. Now, are these maps right? We hope so. There's a lot more validation work to be done. Can they be improved? Absolutely. The architecture we use is not optimized. This was sort of our first cut. Luckily, science liked it, but folks can probably do a lot better. And our hope is to sort of start to fill in the map here, right? So we've done this for 5 countries, but we should, we're not limited by imagery. We're limited by validation data. We should be able to do this everywhere. Okay, so to wrap up, again, a revolution. We think a revolution, a spatial revolution in economics, enabled by a number of things, not least of which is new sensors that allow us to see into these areas in ways we couldn't before. And I think there's a lot of promise in this. And as folks have already mentioned, there's a lot more work to do. And some things we're working on in our group is number 1, scaling this up. Number 2 is temporal prediction, which many folks I've mentioned is a really important policy component of this. And finally, what we're trying to do is, I showed you Imagenet before, and there's this competition, this Imagenet competition, that again, where people compete to sort of build the best model. We're going to try to do this for poverty and release sort of labeled images for poverty, make these publicly available, and our hope is to spur this Imagenet competition, but for this economic development purpose. So if anyone out here, hot coders, want to participate, this will hopefully be up pretty soon. So thanks very much. I'm going to switch hats now